Hi, Grandma here reading Herodotus and the Road to History. We have already read about his visits to Egypt, his visit to Babylon and Phoenicia, and his visits around the Black Sea. Now he needs to do more writing. So we begin chapter 7, I Write My Histories. So in my 37th year, I settled down in Halicarnassus to record my adventures and to share my observations. We Greeks have known of our past mainly from oral traditions, but I wanted to do something new, to write down for future generations what I have discovered about our world today, even if some people aren't going to believe me. Some things I saw and heard for myself, so I can depend on my own sight and judgment. But I couldn't go everywhere, so sometimes I relied on what was told to me. I must admit that I couldn't believe all those tales, but I do like a good story, so I pass them on. I hope the reader understands which were the things I saw and which were the things I only heard about, but some people want to believe anything. And it also seemed important to tell about the wars of the recent past, while there were still eyewitnesses and people who had lived through those times and were eager to talk about them. So my subject was to be the events and achievements not only for the Greeks, but of mankind. It was to be not only about people and how they behaved, but also about the places where they lived, about geography, climate, plants, and animals. I wanted to tell everything I had learned about the known world. I decided to write my stories as lectures, which I could read and recite to entertain and enlighten audiences of my fellow Greeks. I began like this, and this is a quote, and I think it is a direct quote from things that he has written. Herodotus of Halicarnassus hereby publishes the results of his inquiries, hoping to do two things: to preserve the memory of the past by putting on record the astonishing achievements of both the Greek and non-Greek peoples, more particularly to show how the two races came in conflict. Now, I think it's interesting that he's talking about two races, and the two races he's talking about are Greek and non-Greek, which of course we know there are many more races than that. But anyway, of course, I had to start by telling something about the Persians, what they were like and how they had come to rule such a great empire. So I began by telling how Cyrus became king of Persia, ruling from the Greek towns on the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf. I tell how he conquers Babylon. I had heard that for myself. I tell how he got killed in battle, fighting the renowned warriors who live east of the Aral Sea. I had seen these wild people. Now his son, Cambyses, becomes king of Persia. I tell of how Cambyses conquers Egypt and then went mad. And there's a picture of it, of Cambyses goes mad and slays the sacred Apis. I get the idea that that's a sacred cow. And of course, this was a good place to talk about the marvels of Egypt at length, so I did. I was sure the Greeks could never hear enough about Egypt. Now Darius is chosen king. He builds roads and palaces. He organizes his vast empire into 20 provinces and collects annual tributes from his subjects. From the Nubians, and this was south, it would be south of Egypt in the Sudan area. From the Nubians, 2 quarts of gold, 200 logs of ebony, and 20 elephant tusks. From the Arabians, 25.5 tons of frankincense. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term frankincense before. It was one of the spices brought by the 3 magi, or the 3 wise men, to Jesus. And frankincense is used as a perfume. and it is a very valuable perfume, but 25.5 tons is a lot of it. From India, 360 talents of gold dust. From the tribes of the Khmesis, 500 boys, and I don't know who the Khmesis are. I tried Googling it and didn't come up with anything. But anyway, we have a nice picture here. We have a picture of the Nubians and of the Arabians and maybe the Indians and the Khmesis. The person who wrote this book is also an artist, so she did all the drawings, I'm sure. He collected silver from the sale of fish and 120,000 measures of grain and so many talents of gold and silver from his people that he was surely the richest man in the world. I write how Darius decides to attack the Scythians. He builds a bridge across the Bosporus so that now he's in Europe. Darius conquers Thrace and the Scythians. This is a good place to talk about Thrace and Scythia and the Scythians' way of life as I saw them in my travels. And this was in part of his northern travels around the Black Sea. Meanwhile, the Ionian Greeks, my people from the islands in the Aegean Sea, began a revolt. And there's a tiny little map here that shows Ionia, and it shows Asia, and it shows the area where he is from. Now, I tell about Athens and the wonderful beginning of Greek democracy. Freedom is an excellent thing. The Athenians, while under the rule of tyrants, were not a whit more valiant than any of their neighbors. But no sooner did they shake off the yoke than they decidedly the best and foremost. These things show that while undergoing oppression, they let themselves be beaten. But as soon as they got their freedom, each man was eager to do the best he could for himself. So fared it now well with the Athenians. 490 BC, I tell about Marathon, where a Persian army of 25,000 men attacked 10,000 Greeks. The Greeks win a great victory, a small army of brave men against a huge and confident enemy. There's a dramatic story about Herodotus, a Greek at Marathon, who is dispatched to Sparta during the battle, running 26 miles to ask for help. It doesn't come because the Spartans are celebrating a festival. Marathon. Have you ever heard of a marathon? In the Olympics and in the summer months, you often hear of people running marathons. And it is a very long race. It is 26 miles, the distance that Herodotus ran during the battle. Darius dies and his son Xerxes becomes king. Xerxes builds his own bridge across the Hellespont and the Persians cross into Europe. And here we have a picture and you can see how the bridge is made on top of boats. And here is the ruler Xerxes. What do you think could go wrong with a bridge constructed on boats? Well, what happens if one boat sinks? Or what happens if a storm comes through and blows the boats? And who's there to keep the boats strapped together? Are they strapped together somehow? What happens when the tide goes up and down? I just can't even imagine doing that. Anyway, Darius dies and his son Xerxes becomes king and builds his own bridge. It gets more and more exciting for us Greeks. Athens is evacuated. Sparta organizes the Greek cities. All struggles among the Greeks are to stop until the war is over. So by Xerxes building this bridge and the Persians coming in, it has unified the Greek cities, and they have become more of a unified government, like the United States. The United States is separate states that are, we come together and fight one war, usually. Athens, anyway, great navies are assembled and wrecked by storms. Great sea battles are fought. There are 1,000 Persian ships. Xerxes sits on a throne overlooking the battles. When a few Greek deserters were brought into the king's presence, they were asked, "What are the Greeks doing?" They answered, "They are holding the Olympic Games, seeing the athletic sports and the chariot races." So that's something else that is carried on today, the Olympics. And what is the price for which they contend? The answer was an olive wreath, which is given to the man who wins. And we have a picture here of somebody wearing an olive wreath. Today, they don't give them olive wreaths too much anymore, but they do have medals, and but they have in the past. I would say in the 1920s and 1930s, they were still using the olive wreath to crown the winner of the race. Then a courtier exclaimed, "What manner of men are these we fight, who contend with one another, not for money, but for honor?" The fleets and armies of Athens and Sparta, along with the Greek soldiers from other cities, fight back and forth against the Persians. And here we have a map of Greece. And this map shows where each of these battles is. There are great battles at Thermopylae, Artemisium, at Salamis, and Plataea. Okay, so here's Plataea. Here is Artemisium. Here is Thermopylae, Marathon, and Salamis. Finally, the Greeks defeat the Persians. The Persians were brave warriors in the times of Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, but Xerxes was cruel, and the Persians became spoiled by their luxuries. Cyrus had said many years ago that soft places tend to produce soft men, for the same land cannot yield both wonderful crops and men who are noble and brave in war. Cyrus's words proved true. The Greeks won because they lived in a poor part of the world. I work hard along with my scribes, copying and revising my stories until I feel they are ready for the public. There are people who believe that's true today too, that if you have too soft of an upbringing, if you have everything handed to you, as we say, on a silver platter, then you don't learn to fight for things, or you don't learn to have drive, to be able to organize your thoughts and organize your ideas with a plan. I wouldn't know. I had to work for everything. What about you? Is there anybody out there watching this that has everything handed to them on a silver platter? Anyway, that is the end of that chapter. Our next chapter is called To Athens, chapter 8. And then after that, and it's a very short chapter, it's To Thurai, or Turai, and that's also a very short chapter. And then it's the epilogue and it's the end. So we only have really one more reading of this book. Okay, bye-bye.